My name is BugmanCX and today we're going to be looking at 50 abandoned Minecraft ideas. This is a list of features that were planned for, changed, or even added and then removed as part of the game's long history. There's plenty to get through, so let's get right into it. When Notch started testing the earliest versions of Minecraft, he added the first mob for playtesting, the human. This mob would run around randomly with flailing arms and often falling off the edge of the world. During Minecraft's pre-classic era, humans would be spawned in by the player when pressing the G key, and this could be done as many times as you wanted, sometimes with interesting results. The texture for this model was lifted from one of Notch's earlier games, Zombie Town, and although the human mob was only in the game for a short period of time, the code for this mob survived well into Minecraft beta before it was eventually removed. We all know about Minecraft's regular dragon when the player battles it after they've finally reached the end, but Notch also had other plans for dragons in Minecraft. Notch had teased dragons in the past, but when the End Dimension was added along with the Ender Dragon, Notch mentioned that he was planning on adding slightly less dangerous red dragons, but these wouldn't be able to land and they wouldn't destroy terrain. They didn't get added at this point, but Jeb did say they would be added because Notch had promised them. But they never arrived, and by 2015, Dinnerbone had formally shelved the idea. When Jeb was figuring out a system for brewing potions as part of the Adventure update, his idea was to use cauldrons to mix ingredients together to form potions. The cauldron block and the brewing system was added to the game code, but never made accessible within the game. But by using a mod to unlock this feature, we can get access to it. Each time you add ingredients to the cauldron, the brew colour changes and you'll get different status effects from your brew. The game included different potion types like thick, uninteresting, and mundane, 32 of these to be precise. And the original cauldrons gave you access to some effects in the game that were not usually accessible through brewing in later versions, like potions of haste, nausea, and mining fatigue. The original plan was to have brewing recipes tied to the seed, so you'd have a different combination of recipes for each world, but this whole system was deemed way too complicated, so they went for the brewing stand approach instead. During the survival test era, Notch entertained the idea of dirt slabs. During his own development testing, dirt blocks were replaced with dirt slabs, resulting in this strange-looking layered effect. Notch wasn't happy with the idea at all and removed them. Dirt slabs never made their way into a released version of the game. Giants were added temporarily during a version of Indev and were based off of the zombie, but 6 times the size. Because they're so large and cumbersome, the only way for a giant to do any real damage is for it to stand on top of the player. The ability for the giant to spawn naturally was removed in the next version, but the giant code remained in the game for years to follow. In release version 1.8, the zombie AI was removed so that they'd just stand there and do nothing, and in the 1.15 snapshot 18W50A, their AI was temporarily reactivated and a chicken jockey version was also included, but these changes were reverted before the 1.14 release. Axolotls were announced for Minecraft 1.17 Caves and Cliffs during the Minecraft Live event. On the Minecraft website, a teaser image showed 3 axolotls, including a green variant. But this green variant was just an early test and it was never added to the game. When Jeb was working on villager trading for the 1.3 update, the trading currency was going to be rubies. Jeb posted screenshots of the trading interface complete with this new ruby. This new gem could be found by mining ruby ore blocks, but during testing, Dinnerbone said that because he was red-green colorblind, it was too difficult to distinguish the difference between the ruby ore and the redstone ore blocks. And so rubies and ruby ore were changed to emeralds. But when the game was released, Jeb forgot to swap out the old ruby ore texture, and that made its way into the game before it was fixed. For the Caves and Cliffs update, it was announced that Archaeology would be added to the game. If the player happened to spot an archaeological dig site, they could use a brush to sift through soil and discover artifacts. If the player discovered ceramic shards, they could be incorporated into clay pots and used for decoration. Although the teaser footage showed this system as working, it was never implemented and was put back on the shelf. During Alpha, Notch was working on the first set of biomes to be added to the game, and things were quite different then to how they are today. He'd implemented biomes like the rainforest, swampland and the desert, but also 2 cold biomes, the tundra and the taiga. But another cold biome was also implemented, the ice desert. Although due to the specific temperature and rainfall requirements for this biome to generate, it wasn't possible for the game to generate it with the vanilla terrain generation, so it never actually appeared within the vanilla game. It was removed alongside all of the other alpha biomes with the terrain overhaul in beta 1.8. With the 1.19 wild update, frogs were added into the swamp biomes. These frogs were intended to eat fireflies, which would be small particle-like creatures flying around in the air, and you'd occasionally see a frog grab one from the air with its tongue, and the frog would produce a frog light. When it was realised that some fireflies are poisonous to frogs, the fireflies were scrapped, and frogs now prefer to eat slimes and produce the frog lights from eating magma cubes instead. In Snapshot 12W34A, an angry villager head was added into the particle textures. This was probably going to be used to show whenever a villager becomes angry, but ultimately, this texture remained unused. Similarly, hidden within the new trading interface's texture files, there's a speech bubble which was probably used to test out ways for the villagers to communicate what types of trades they had to offer. Strangely, it looks like the arrow textures for the actual trading interface were pasted over it in a rush before removing the unused texture underneath. Also, what a weird trade. If you want to trade my stinky chicken for your nice fresh meat, I'm down with that. Dinnerbone once toyed around with the idea of adding coloured planks to match Minecraft's 16 colour palette, but this was never added. In Beta 1.3, Jeb was figuring out a way to allow players to set their respawn location to prevent them respawning all the way back at world spawn whenever they died. Jeb was experimenting with a special block that players could use for this, the Crying Obsidian block. The block texture was added to the texture files, but not the block itself, because the idea was changed and beds got implemented instead. Fast forward all the way to 1.16 with the Nether update, and it was decided that players should be able to set their spawn in the Nether, and what better way to do this than by using a Crying Obsidian block to build a respawn anchor. Around Beta 1.6, Notch was working on creating a brand new dimension for the game. This would be known as the Skylands and serve as an opposite to the Nether. This would be a dimension way up in the sky, high above the clouds, and made up of floating islands. This wasn't the first time we'd seen floating islands in the game, but this was the first time we'd seen them in infinite terrain. Notch explained that the Skylands would be like a dream world. Sometimes when you'd go to bed, there'd be a chance that you'd wake up in this dream world. The sky dimension was implemented into the game's code, but it was ultimately unfinished and not possible to access without enabling it through a mod. The Skylands idea was parked, but eventually got re-implemented to become the end. During Minecraft Classic, Doc, the game's artist at the time, was working on creating new mobs to be included in the game, and the first of these to be tested was Rana. Rana was copied over from another one of Doc's projects and only implemented for this testing. Rana was then removed when 3 new models were introduced: Steve, Black Steve, and Beast Boy. These are based on the MD3 model type, which is a high-resolution model developed by id Games and used in games like Quake, but it felt out of place for Minecraft's blocky environment. Doc had trouble getting the animations to work, and Notch wasn't happy with the direction things were going. And let's just say that due to creative differences, Doc and Mojang parted ways, and these mobs were removed from the game. In 13W16A, horse saddles were added. These were introduced to go along with the new horse mob, and you could craft them with some leather and iron for stirrups, and they stacked up to 32. But they didn't last long, and in 13W18A they were removed, so you'd just use the regular saddle for both pigs and horses. In the 1.15 Buzzy Bees update, textures for crystallized honey and the wax block were found in Snapshot 19W34A. Although these look cool and players are always intrigued by new building blocks, the textures were added by accident to the snapshot and removed a short while later. The Minecraft Village and Pillage update saw a big update for villagers and a new family of antagonists known as the Illagers. The Pillager, the Vindicator and the Evoker were all added, but there was a fourth one as well, the Illusioner. The Illusioner is armed with a bow and casts spells while attacking, capable of casting a spell of blindness against the player. But it also has another trick up its sleeve, the ability to become invisible and create duplicates of itself to confuse the player and hover around the location of the Illusioner. If you manage to damage the Illusioner while it's performing this trick, the duplicates will snap back to the location of the Illusioner, giving you a clue to where it is. Although this mob exists in the game and it's fully functional and works properly, it was never added and isn't accessible in vanilla survival. When the horses were added to Minecraft 1.6.1, two unusual variations were also added into the game, the zombie horse and the skeleton horse. Back then, both of these were unused mobs, meaning they wouldn't spawn naturally in the world, but the skeleton horse was implemented in Minecraft 1.9 for the new skeleton trap. The zombie horse still exists in the game and even has its own spawn egg, but it remains inaccessible in vanilla survival. The cog, or the gear, was one of the earliest attempts at redstone-style behaviour. It was added to the game during in-dev, and although it wasn't possible to obtain it in the regular game, it was possible to put it into your inventory using external tools. Once you had it, you could place it on blocks, and the gear will animate, spinning clockwise or anti-clockwise depending on how it's been placed. Gears placed adjacent to each other will spin in opposite directions, giving the illusion of moving with each other, but in reality it's just an animation and they don't actually do anything. Much later in Minecraft Alpha, this idea was replaced with redstone. When creating the villages, or as Notch referred to them back then, the towns, Notch wanted to implement some visible borders around the edges of a village to help the player figure out where the boundaries of that village were. He came up with the idea of implementing borders, but was unhappy with everything he'd tried. There are two unused textures in the game which resemble borders, and if you apply them to the grass, they kinda look like this. Not great, and not really compatible with all the different block types. Ultimately, Notch abandoned the whole idea of visible borders entirely. As a rudimentary test for generating structures in the very early infinite terrain generation, brick pyramids were introduced. They reached from the sky limit to deep underground, and were solid, full of bricks. They were absolutely enormous, but easy to generate procedurally. In these versions, the pyramids would always generate in the same coordinates, regardless of the world seed. But even so, it's still difficult to find them because there are no coordinates to follow in these early InfDev versions, and it's not possible to even save or resume your game. But the addition of the Obsidian walls helps you out a little here. The Obsidian walls were a temporary structure starting at world spawn and running off in all four cardinal directions. If you follow the direction of one for quite a long distance from world spawn, you'll eventually come across a brick pyramid. In pre-classic, when the human skin was added, Notch just imported it from another one of his games, Zombie Town. This original skin had a beard, but when the concept of the character was introduced, both the character and this mob used the same skin, but the texture was replaced with a beardless version, supposedly to make the player character appear more gender neutral. Despite this texture now being beardless, Bearded Steve still continued to be used in promotional artwork for the game for many years to follow. In Minecraft 1.19.2, with the addition of new base skins for players, the Steve skin was reintroduced with his beard. Was Minecraft InDev going to contain tables and chairs? It's never quite been cleared up, but in the game's texture files from that period, you can clearly see two textures which resemble a chair and a table. There was also an extra wooden planks texture that was added, which might have been for another part of the furniture. Notch had mentioned that he wanted to add furniture at some point, and maybe this was a test. It's not possible to access these blocks through any normal gameplay means, but if you modify the data values of wheat and give them growth stages higher than their maximum level, it's possible to trick the game into drawing them. And here's what they might look like, but here's a 3D render instead, which shows what the chair could have looked like when it uses all of the textures combined. I'm sure we all know that the creeper was created when Notch got the measurements wrong when trying to create a pig, but the early version of the creeper actually behaved quite differently. Unlike today where a creeper attacks you by creeping up and exploding itself, way back in survival tests they had a simple melee attack. If you managed to kill one, it would explode on the ground, complete with smoke particles. Pigmen were planned to be the original inhabitants of villages. Mick Lee was behind the idea for these mobs and created the original skin for them. His persistent suggestions to Notch about including them in the game resulted in Notch agreeing to add them. Notch had already added the zombie pigman variation to the Nether and was planning to include the regular pigmen to populate these new villages. But Notch changed his mind and we got the villagers instead. But the pigman idea didn't entirely die there. In 2012, Dinnerbone talked about coding for a new mob. Coding some new mob stuffs. This is hilarious, he has no clothes. The community started to theorise that this had to be the return of the pigman, but it was never said and this mob never got implemented. It was years later in 2020 when Dinnerbone finally clarified that this was going to be a type of pigman, but a pigman bodyguard that you could get to fight for you. Imagine that. The teaser poster for the Alpha 1.2 Halloween update listed a whole bunch of new features that were going to be added along with the Nether. One of them was torches that burn out. Imagine trying to light up your base area only to discover that after a while all of your torches keep going out and need to be relit. The poster did say that you could place lanterns that would last forever, but none of this ever got implemented. Interestingly, the burnt out torches idea did get implemented in the 2013 April Fool's Minecraft 2.0 joke version, but obviously this wasn't in the main game. Coloured lighting is something that many players have always wanted since Minecraft's early days, but it was always said that it would be too difficult or too taxing to implement. The Mogminer, one of the game's developers, did test out coloured lighting for Minecraft 1.8, but it was buggy and never made it into the full release. Petrified Oak Slabs are a bit of a retcon for Minecraft, something which was added kind of by accident but never originally planned for. Slab variants got added in Beta 1.3, and since all slabs are pretty much the same block and they all behave the same way, they all shared the same block ID. A data value is set to specify which texture variant to use, and hey ho, off we go. But all slabs shouldn't be alike. Slabs made from wood should be flammable, but because slabs all share the same properties, it meant that wooden slabs were inflammable, and players could use them to build wooden structures that would never burn down. But of course, this wasn't the intended behaviour, and in Minecraft 1.3.1, when the new wood types were added, a separate block ID was given to slabs made from wood. So from now on, whenever you crafted them, they'd still produce slabs, but with a new block ID. But if you still had the old ones in your world, they'd still look and behave the same way as they did before. And in Minecraft 1.13, when the flattening removed all block IDs, in order to make sure that these old blocks continued to work the way they used to, they were reintroduced as the Petrified Oak Slab. But these blocks weren't even accessible in the creative menu. You had to use commands to give them to the player. Jeb had planned to add a new flower to 1.7.2, the Paeonia. This was the same flower at his wedding. Aww. But despite the texture being added, the flower never ended up being implemented, and a too high variant, the Peony, was added instead. The Deep Dark in 1.19 added all sorts of new Sculk blocks, and one that never quite made it was the Calibrated Sculk sensor. In 20W49A, the textures for this block were added, resembling a new Sculk sensor covered in what looks like an opaque early amethyst crystal structure. These textures were added in by mistake because the block never ended up being added. The Sculk Jaw, or the Sculk Trap, was a block planned as part of the Deep Dark. Walking on it would change its texture, and it was probably intended to do some kind of damage to the player. But King B-Dogs said he wasn't happy with the block, and it was abandoned from the final release. During in-dev, the Quiver was added, along with new studded armour, both of which were borrowed from another one of Notch's games, Legend of the Chambered. Although it existed in the game at this time, it didn't have any functionality. Despite it existing as a texture for a long time, in 2011 Jeb stated that quivers wouldn't be added. But during the development period for release 1.9, Dinnerbone posted a cryptic tweet revealing a picture of the player inventory including a quiver. He said that he was just trying this idea out, but had abandoned it because holding the arrows in the offhand felt more natural. But honestly, who does that? If you managed to kill a skeleton during survival test, when it died, it would explode arrows. When C418 was first working on the sound and music for Minecraft, audio loops were included in the game's files, which were probably going to be added as ambient sounds depending on where the player was at the time. Here's a small snippet, but you can hear these full loops on the Minecraft wiki. The concept art for the Phantom originally included a mouth, because the idea was that this mob would fly down from the sky and bite the player. But in the early tests, the developers thought this looked too much like a sock puppet, so its mouth was removed and the overall mob design was changed. Way back in InDev, when Doc was working on new promotional materials for the game, this was one of the Minecraft logo options being considered. In Alpha, the main menu updated the Minecraft logo to an animated version that would build itself out of stone blocks. But when this logo was eventually replaced, the idea of a self-building logo went with it. Early graphics for the player inventory indicated some kind of player stats that could have been for attack, defense, and speed. But even Notch couldn't remember what they were for. In Beta 1.8, a footprint texture was added to the game's texture files, but never implemented anywhere in the game. In the 2020 April Fool's snapshot, the footprint was added as a joke item, and in the 2022 April Fool's snapshot, anytime the player would carry an item, footsteps would generate behind them. During snapshot 14W27A, rabbits were added, including a hostile version known as the Killer Rabbit of Cabanog, which is a reference to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The first versions were quite bloody across the rabbit's face and body, but Jeb wasn't too fond of this mob, calling it a tired joke, so its ability to spawn naturally was removed. Luck and Bad Luck are two status effects introduced during the 1.9 snapshots. These affect the player's chances of receiving better loot from certain loot tables within the game. They were only added as an experiment, but after map makers were using them for their own maps, the functionality was left in the game, but just not accessible in vanilla survival. Minecarts were first introduced during InfDev and originally intended to be fillable with items. If you right-click on them, they contain an inventory and items can be added or removed. As the minecart gets more and more full, the dirt layer inside of the cart will also appear to fill up. This behaviour was changed shortly after, as the minecart with chest was included instead. In 2010, an option to enable 3D Anaglyph was added for players who wanted to play the game with 3D glasses, but this was removed in 2017 because 3D glasses weren't cool anymore. Between 1.7.2 and 1.9, there was a button called the Super Secret Settings which would play a sound and activate some super cool shaders. In 1.7.4, you were able to stream directly to Twitch from right within the game, and this included integration with the Twitch chat, but this behaviour was removed in 1.9. You used to be able to take an isometric screenshot of your in-dev world by pressing F7, and this would give you a really awesome 3D screenshot of your world. But with the introduction of infinite terrain in InfDev, this feature got removed and never re-added. Bundles are a new storage item tested out for the Caves and Cliffs update to address issues with inventory management and to provide a new way of gathering items. During playtesting, feedback wasn't positive, and although the items still exist in the code and you can obtain them through a data pack, they aren't included in the vanilla game. Yet. In Beta 1.9, as the player explored the lowest layers of the world, a fog effect would appear. This was known as the void fog, and it would get darker and darker the closer you got to the lowest layers of your world. This remained in the game for a few years, but by the 1.8 release, it was removed. So, what do you think of my list? There's probably many more, and I'd love to hear your comments down below if you think I missed anything that should have made it. You can also check out my series Minecraft The Journey, where I've been upgrading a survival world all through the versions of Minecraft where we explore its history. I want to say thank you to all of my patrons for supporting me and keeping me going, and you can find out how to do that if you want to do it yourself down in the links below. For now, I'll see you next time. Whew, you smell.